welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely gorgeous new novel about one of my favorite, not just actresses, but one of my favorite people of all time. And I am so excited to delve into this person and this gorgeous book that she inspired. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
My name is Priya Parmar, and my novel is called The Original.
Oh, so good. I enjoyed learning so much more about Katharine Hepburn than I ever knew before, and I thought I knew a lot. And it just really made me appreciate her journey so much more. What an interesting, fascinating figure who was so ahead of her time, but also of it, and just like so interesting. But before I start to, sing her praises too much, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer and perhaps your other works that kind of led you here.
Absolutely. So I started off actually in academia. I was doing a PhD and it was in theater and literature. And so my background was very much, the research part of it, but my writing was critical. And then I started working, and then I realized, critical writing not that fun and creative writing much more fun. So I actually made the switch and I started working with a playwright, E. Vensler, and I started writing creatively. And then my first novel was called Exit the Actress. My last novel was called Vanessa and Her Sister, which is about Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell and their very complicated, very difficult relationship. And then I sort of took a break from novels and went back to the theater and wrote for the West End in London. And that was a show called Sylvia, which is it was at the Old Vic, and now it's going on tour and hopefully coming to Broadway. So that's what I've been doing. So, and then I came back to this, which was, you know, amazing. So having a balance is lovely. Being able to do both is lovely.
I'm so glad to hear that Sylvia is going to come to Broadway because as I was reading about it, I'm like, this sounds absolutely fascinating. This sounds amazing. And it does lead into my question about sort of looking at all of these works together. What is it that makes you want to explore a particular person's inner life or relationships through the lens of a novel or a play of fiction?
So I'm sure this has my roots in being a researcher and being, sort of a critical, academic because I'm forensic about primary research. I'm obsessed with the primary research and the as you're doing it, kind of a person takes shape in your brain. And that's whether you're doing it critically or doing it creatively. Doing it critically, you kind of have to ignore that person that starts talking in your brain and stick to, just things that you can 100% prove factually and footnote and all the other terrible things that go along with critical writing, which I love critical writers. I just don't want to be one of them anymore. But creative writing, you can give that person who's been, walking around your head and talking and moving in and making camp, like you can give that person free rein. And so you have the kind of the crust of what happened. You have the kind of the topography of what happened, but then the entire kind of emotional infrastructure, that whole layer that's holding up that crust of what happened, that's all up for imagination. And I love that process of figuring out why would she have done this? Why would she have made that choice? Why, so that's been something that I've just really enjoyed in all my writing. And I seem to be drawn to women in the arts. I seem to be drawn to women who really make a difference in the arts. And and I don't mean to, I don't plan to. It's just, it seems to be my creative home. So.
So I'd love to know, that we've talked about your writing journey, your journey as a fan and person who was interested in Katharine Hepburn, because I have loved her since probably when I got interested in old movies, when I was approaching high school into college and developing a sort of like, good taste in movies to the extent that I have it. But
Yeah.
she's just so fascinating and captivating. So what was your entry point into her career and exploring her life?
I mean, it's interesting because I've always loved old movies, and I don't know, it's a kind of a nature nurture thing. I don't know if it's because that's what I was exposed to really young, but I was the 10-year-old who was like gonna have all the girls over for the sleepover for my birthday, and it's like, we're gonna watch Vertigo. And they're like, really? Like, it's so I've always loved old movies. And I loved her in particular. Little Women was kind of my entry point. It used to come on once a year, and I would wait and wait and wait all year. And that was just, it would always be sort of right around Christmas. And it was like, it was just a high point of my year that I remember. Meet Me in St. Louis came on once a year, and Little Women came on once a year. And those were like big high points for me. So I adored her, from the very beginning. And I remember my mom actually told me when the first time I saw Philadelphia Story, I must have been in high school, I think. And she told me, Katharine Hepburn turned Hollywood on its head to make this movie. And it sort of must have lodged in my brain somewhere because I never forgot that story. And, I've sort of, the way you fall down rabbit holes, on Google, and so that was just something that I'd looked at just for fun, just out of interest, all my life. And I love her clothes and I love her, just everything. So it was I, there was always a kind of a magnetic pull for her for me, and but writing about her, it was daunting. And it's always that thing of like when you're figuring out who you're going to write about, there's always that person who's sort of out there and you're like, well, I couldn't possibly do that. And like Virginia Woolf was that. I was like, well, that's not happening. There's no way I'm writing anything in the voice of Virginia Woolf. That's just not on. And then Katharine Hepburn was the same. And it's sort of, I've gotten to the stage where I know when it's the one I couldn't possibly write about because it's way too scary, that's the one. That's like, it's like the third rail is well the power, that's where all the power is. And that's where you have to go. And so, yeah, so I knew it was going to be her. And the research was just a joy, just a complete joy.
I do have so many questions about the research. And I'm curious, something that I think these two women share in common is that they both had really what I would call like unique, instantly recognizable voices, whether that's like the written word or the way that their cadence, the way that they speak, Is that more or less intimidating as a writer to have such a prominent voice to emulate, or is it, you know what I'm kind of trying to get at?
Oh yeah, much more.
Yeah.
Much more. Wouldn't it be great if she had one of those voices that could take shape and sound totally different? No, no, she always sounds like her. Um, and so I spent the morning in Old Saybrook yesterday. I was at the Katharine Hepburn Cultural Arts Center, which is just known colloquially as the Kate. And I feel like they should rename that town Katharine Hepburnville because we went into a cafe and there's like her books are all over the shelves, like not just, stacked in the shelf. They're like displayed, just instead of like got milk signs, there's like got Kate's. I mean, it was spectacular. I loved everything about it. But everybody, I was talking to the curator of the Kate Museum, and she was saying everybody, so you meet so many people and they all have a story about her. And she is exactly who we think she is. And I just love that consistency that she was exactly the same. There's a story about her telling somebody, you're not allowed to paint the fire hydrant green. It has to be red. Fire hydrants are red. What are you doing? Like, just pulling over on her bicycle on the side of the road and telling somebody that. So she just yeah, I love everything about her. And she's completely daunting, but she got friendlier as the process went on, which was nice. So,
Speaking of your research process and the Kate Center that you have visited, what else did you do for research? I'm sure that you rewatched a lot of her stuff, maybe to help in capturing her voice. And as a person, I am also a former academic who, loved writing but didn't love critical writing, loved reading it, just did not love producing it. I really, really enjoyed getting into that research process because it's hard and not everything that you get that's fascinating ends up on the page. And I love to just, honor that process.
Yes. Yes. Oh God, the cutting room floor is a heartbreaking place.
It is.
Um, yeah, no, I rewatched her movies, absolutely. Just, especially those kind of Bill of Divorcement is one that because it was her very, very first. And then, and then she has several interviews. One of them is the Dick Cavett interview. And it's a long interview. And her friend Irene Selznick talked her into doing it. And she wasn't sure she was going to do it. He was totally unprepared because he was thinking she was just coming by to meet him. And then she was like, let's do it now. And then off they go and they do it right. And it was just so her. But before the interview starts, there's sort of 4 minutes where she's setting the stage. And in those 4 minutes, she needs a table here. And the hair person's like doing her hair and she's saying, okay, I want it to be falling down like this. And I want it to be. And so she's really setting the stage for being Katharine Hepburn. I need to be able to put my foot up. I need to be able to have my hair falling down so I can pile it all back up on my head. I need to, this chair is wobbly. It was so interesting because it made me realize exactly how much of her is deliberate, how much she's crafted who she is. The icon that we know is someone she wants us to know. It's someone she's created for us. So that was an extraordinarily helpful thing. The Billy Rose, the archives in the libraries, her letters, and there are so many biographies of her. So much has been written about her. And then I went to, luckily I'm in Connecticut at the moment. My mom is living here and I'm taking care of my mom. So I was able to go, to all of the places where she lived and all the places where she went and where she went, so it was all that. And then I was in LA, I'm sure people thought, what is this person doing staring at my house? Because, I guess I was, it's places where she was living in her early 20s. So they're not, the famous, this house was, it's not the famous place where she lived, which actually belonged to George Cukor. It's not there. It's, the little bungalows and beautiful little houses she was living in her 20s. And I was snooping around all over the place and taking pictures. So it was a really fun, long, long process. And I was so careful with the research because if people love her as much as I do, you have to get it right. So it's exhaustive.
I bet too. And the specter of her herself, sort of watching over you and being like, are you, getting this right? So-
Absolutely. She's
Mhm.
the first person I've ever written about where I knew what their actual voice sounded like. I knew we have a very, very brief recording of Virginia Woolf, but it's very, very brief. And you don't really have a sense of what she sounded like when she was the age she was when I was writing about her. Whereas Katharine Hepburn, we really do know what she sounded like. So you really can't imagine her coming back to sort of haunt you.
Mm. But you do it so beautifully, both in her dialogue and in the narration. Like, 'cause sometimes the narration sort of has that, like, to me, it sounded like her sort of like her dreamy, tragic monologues in the Philadelphia story, and there was like one line right after she suffers a loss early on where she thinks something to herself, better close down the whole business of being a person. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I could just hear that in her voice.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh God, she had such a sad childhood. I mean, that's the thing is that she was coming out of so much loss. And so the stakes were so high for her. Like she was out for total reinvention, because she was just coming out of such terrifying, you know, a family that was just marked by such deep loss. Um, all over the place on both sides. So, but yeah, oh, I'm so glad that line worked for you. Um, oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. And it really does, you know, I think something that I love about like artists, writing about artists, is that there's just so much potential in comparing or juxtaposing like the performance with the inner world of the person and what like the gap between that or the coherence between that. And, and so sort of talking about that, I'd love to get into the aspects of her gender presentation and her sexual orientation that you get into, because she was, as we said earlier, very ahead of her time and very progressive. So could you tell us a little bit about that and Laura, perhaps?
Yes, Laura Harding was she was known as the American Express heiress, even though that's not actually where her family predominantly made its wealth. But she was a very good friend of Katharine Hepburn's. They had both studied with the voice coach, Frances Robinson Duff, which is about the best name for a voice coach. You can't make that up.
Really is.
I know it's fabulous. And so they there was speculation at the time about their nature of their relationship. We can't ever know. I was talking to the curator of the Kate Museum yesterday, and she was saying, while we can't ever know, it's at, she the way she presents reads differently now than it did then. And this is my best guess. And it's I, I think I think it's very likely that she had passionate love affairs with men and women is what I think is likely. We can't ever know, but given all the evidence, given all of the choices that she made, that would be my best guess. So that's kind of where I decided that that's the sort of the story that I decided to tell, because that's the one that feels like her choices made the most sense. All of the choices that she made. Like when she had the most power in her career, at this point, she had just come out of Alice Adams, which is a huge hit. And what does she make? She makes Sylvia Scarlett. And just with that astonishingly gorgeous haircut, which if I thought I could pull off, I would do it in 2 seconds flat, and that story, that sort of very, very, there's so many queer tropes in that story, which are just fantastic, which were so ahead of their time. And when you have all this power and that's what you choose to do, you have to think, okay, that's your passion project. That's the story you wanted to tell. And she spends most of that film playing a woman who's playing you playing a woman who's playing a man. It's just just some extraordinary choices. And I mean, my God, some of the best costumes you've ever seen. So yeah, it's amazing. So yeah, so that was I mean, there are people who've come forward. There's a guy called Scotty Bowers who came forward and said absolutely, da da da. But it's all it's all secondhand. She made a couple of comments that were highly controversial about a woman who was her sort of like assistant, everything else later in her life. But we don't know how she exactly meant those comments. So there's, it's a hotly contested point, but this is a novel. This is a story. And this was the story that made the most sense to me.
Yeah, and I expect that that's sort of, where that alchemy of like the mix between the creative writing and your research kind of comes into play, because there is the circumstantial stuff that you're talking about that you find in the research. And then also like contextually in Hollywood in the 30s, like that wouldn't have been a totally unusual way for people to live. Like it's very parallel to like Cary Grant's story.
Well, Hollywood, it's so interesting because, it's something that I didn't anticipate being topical and timely, but it's actually Hollywood was coming out of this or was in this super permissive period where it was not at all unusual for somebody to have a girlfriend and a boyfriend and a husband. And that was all, that was not unusual. And it's sort of like the whole town was in on it. The press were in on it. The studios knew, it was not, none of this was a secret. The people weren't closeted in that way. They were living their lives and people knew, and it's what it was, and which is amazing. And then the sort of the more conservative elements in the country kind of were pushing for, they were hearing these rumors seeping out of that coast, and they were like, what is happening over there? And they pushed to in strict, sort of to constrict that life and to impose a moral code, which was called the production code, which is why you have in the 30s, you have these unbelievable films where you know, uh, people have affairs, people have sex before marriage, people have, just all these sorts of things. And then you get later, and that kind of all falls off, and you get into a couple is sort of sleeping in twin beds, and, you know, don't, there's no sense of physical intimacy at all between them. And that was a shift that came with the production code. So it was a really interesting time in Hollywood that kind of I didn't know about it. I knew about the films, and I knew there was such a thing as the production code, but before I started this research, I really didn't understand how far it pulled kind of culture of that city, from a kind of a more free, permissive, LGBTQ friendly, you know, as the there's I'm here at a party with two different people, and isn't that great? To being just completely everything has to be hidden. And we're really just coming out of that now in terms of Hollywood stars in the last like 20, 30 years. So it's a really interesting um, time to be writing this novel, as well as it was just a fascinating time to research.
Oh, I bet. Absolutely. It does feel so timely in a way, even though it captures its own time period so well. Because yeah, a lot of these arguments are being relitigated too. So
Yes,
yeah.
we're having the same conversations.
Yeah. I have one more question. The right word is not periodization, but I am curious about why you chose to sort of like focus on this sliver of time rather than, there are some sweeping, historical memoirs out there. And I think it makes it comes alive, and it really makes not the thesis, but like sort of the angle of your framing. So at what point, like in your research and drafting, like did your angle, if we want to call it, emerge?
I mean, I knew I was interested in, I always sort of write to a question, and the question's always the same. And even when I try and escape this question, it kind of comes back. And even when I think I'm writing about something totally different, there it is. Oh, look, I'm digging through to find the same answer to this question again. And the question's always, what is the deal you make to live the life you need to live? And that was what I was interested in. What deal was she making? What deal was Cary Grant making? What compromises? What was the cost? What was the really human cost of becoming this icon that we know today? And this period in her life, I never know when a novel is going to end until it invariably ends with me being up all night, and I suddenly realize I'm like, oh my God, this is it. I'm about to land the plane. It's now. And I never know it's coming. It's weird. You would think I would have an idea. Never seem to have an idea that it's coming. I know it's sort of out there, but I never know it's going to be that day. With this, she turned Hollywood on its head, and and I don't want to give things away, but it's a very specific arc, and it's not my arc, it's her arc of that time. And so it felt right to end it when she kind of had knew what cost she was going to be paying to live this life. And she and she had engineered certain things in her career, and in her life. And that's so I can't say too much without giving it all away, but like but so it had a very specific arc. We associate her with raging success, 4 Oscars. We think of her as going strength to strength. No actor, male or female, has ever, won more Oscars than her, ever. And the only time she ever showed up was at the Oscar ceremony, was when it was to give an award. It
Mm.
wasn't even to receive a award. It was, just astonishing. And of course she wore like linen trousers and open-toed sandals. It's amazing. Anyway, but we think of her as being this huge success. And in actual fact, she had a very bumpy childhood and then had a very bumpy time when she got to Hollywood and met with some, not just, failure, but just almost drummed out of town. And that, to come back from that and be the person who lives in our imagination is fairly extraordinary. And so that was kind of the arc that was the trajectory I wanted to investigate.
That's fascinating to me that it comes back to the question, because one of the things that I do remember from being in grad school in the humanities was my advisor saying that like people think they go to grad school to learn how to answer questions. They are here to learn how to ask questions, to ask the right question. And it seems like that is like you landed on the right question, and that suggested your time frame and the arc and everything. So yeah.
Absolutely. And with her, it's just, I mean, and it's never the answer is never what I think. It's never, it's that person who shows up during the research. They actually answer the question like that as the character builds and as the character sort of self-defines and shows who they are. That's, the answer, it sort of comes from somewhere that's not me. My editor would be so horrified that I just said that out loud. But it's a really interesting process, and because it's you do all of this research and then this person arrives and they answer the question. It's a wonderful, fun, joyous thing to be able to do.
Wow. So who are you who will you be, channeling next? Who are you in contact with?
I'm circling several people, but it's sort of like this awful letting go process of when you walk away from someone, and I'm having trouble. So everybody that I pick is sort of right now I sort of land on them and I'm like, okay. And then you get a little bit of buyer's remorse. And then you're like, really? Are you doing it? But you're not Kate. And then it's a trial and error period right now. And so I'm just waiting until something, scares me to death. And then I'm like, oh, it's you. That's kind of what I'm in right now.
Wow. Well, I don't want to say that I, look forward to you being scared to death, but I look forward to to the
Oh, thank
next work.
you.
So
Thank you. Thank you.
you're very welcome. And listeners, please, you should absolutely 100% check out the original. It is a gorgeous piece of writing, and you'll learn so much about Kate, about Hollywood at the time, a really interesting transitional period in Hollywood too, and in her life. It will be available when you hear this. So head to your favorite bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go for books. Do you have a bookstore that you like to send people to?
I love all independent bookstores. I love libraries. I love librarians. I love, yeah, I think they're doing just the most spectacular work. So any independent bookstore that is near you that, absolutely.
Yes, love that. Excellent answer. All right. Thank you again. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.